Well, good morning, everybody. You know, a few weeks ago, I made a statement about the upcoming pattern here for the month of May. And the statement was that I didn't think that 2019 was going to go on repeat. And one of the reasons for that was this is what 2019 looked like. It was extremely dry in the Pacific Northwest for the front half of May. And then we were setting records across much of the central United States, from Kansas down to Texas, all the way over to the Mississippi Valley. And we were wet up the East Coast as well. The places that were drier were through the Canadian Prairie, and they were also through the northern tier of the United States. And the pattern that led us into this started at the end of April and looks something like this. Now, it's unique. It's different from this year, but in some places the outcomes are the same or even worse. And this is what happened. The Pacific High, which normally lives here, was displaced. It was closer to the West Coast. And you've heard me talk a lot about that lately, but I want to put that into context because in this particular year, we got into a pattern that did this, okay? And we had this trough of low pressure that lived in Canada, and the flow came around it like this. So why were we drier in the Northwest? Too close to the ridge. Why were we drier in Canada? Backside of the trough. But all this flow came together right here with an average jet stream level wind of like 200 miles an hour from California all the way to the Northeast, where there was a larger ridge sitting here for most of the front half of May, and it lasted. So it's actually a much different look than we've had this year, but the rain has been coming. So what's going on this year, and why can we say it's so much different from 19, even though a lot of you feel as though it's as wet as 19? This is what we have this year. So our ridge is here. The faster flow sneaks into this area. There's no deep trough in the Canadian Prairie. It's just dipping in the west. And there is some sense of ridging here, but this again gets the flow to do something like this. And the reality of it is that if this is what it looked like in 19 to start May, this is what it looks like this year. But there are places on this map that are experiencing extremely wet May. I think about the low, what was that, about a week ago, that sat over Montana just delivering all this precipitation. We're still quite wet in California and to Oregon, where the storm systems continue to enter and dip. We've got extremely wet conditions throughout Iowa, and a lot of folks, I just almost nonstop communication with folks in Iowa about the implications of this rain and what we're about to forecast. We're record wet in Texas, and unfortunately, where the storms are lining up over the next few days, we're going to continue to hammer this area. Because of last week's rainfall, we've now seen this region in the Mid-South getting over toward the Appalachian Mountains go wet, and while we've broken kind of the risk of the near-term drought in the Carolinas getting up to Georgia, some of the large storm complexes that have gone through here lately have done some damage. Now you can find a couple of holes in this, which we didn't find in 2019. I mean, that's 19 again, and this is this year. But the reality of it is that we're seeing, especially in the Midwestern United States, of course, that's my backyard, so that's what I hear a lot about. There's been just a lot of delays. We've had crop switching down here across the Southeast because of too much precipitation, and the flooding in through here. I wish I had time to travel down and just see friends and colleagues in this area to know how wet things have been. Now, putting that all together and just thinking through it, I also want to give you another map. This is what the last month has looked like in terms of sunlight reaching the ground. It's a cumulative downward solar flux anomaly from the CDAS data set. And as you look at it, the cooler colors represent where there has been a deficit of sunlight. And I just mentioned that area down here in Texas because when you start to stack this up, this is the equivalent of having so much cloud cover that it's as though in the last month we had no sunshine for 3 straight days. That's kind of how much is missing in this area. And take a look throughout the Canadian Prairie, all the way over here to Ontario and Quebec. Again, a lot of persistent cloud cover has been there. And you're going, wait a minute, you just showed that this area was extremely wet. There's been actually stretches of just pure sunshine in this area. But when the rain comes through, it's really, really just dumped. Now, I spent about an hour and a half yesterday just talking with my colleagues about this, and I got to sit down in the morning with Matt Reardon. Matt is he's one of my former students, but he's brilliant, and I hope someday this kid just surpasses me and does amazing things. That would be a career goal of mine. But we brought up some discussion here about ocean temperatures, and one of our favorite websites is Tropical Tidbits. I've told you all that millions of times. A couple of things to look at on this. What I did, by the way, if I went to Tropical Tidbits, this is the main website. I just strolled over here to Analysis Tools, and I clicked on Ocean Analysis. That's where we are. Levi Cowan, who created this page, I believe he now works for the National Hurricane Center. Brilliant young scientist as well. what he's made here is a few different ways to view sea surface temperatures. So you have your actual temperatures, you have your anomalies. So this compares to historical past, the change in the last week. Down here in the bottom left, this is the difference from the global average. So in other words, it's not relative to history, it's relative to now. And then you have certain areas. You can click on this to get different basins. And we're going to leave it right here on Nino region 3.4. That's the middle of the Pacific. This is our most common area to watch for the evolution of an ENSO event, either El Nino or La Nina. And you can see now we're down to 0. This is the evidence that the trade winds have regained their position and strength. We have stopped the El Nino weakness of the trade winds, and the upwelling has started to occur. And that's why you see these kind of cold water trails here. Now, what I want to do is this. I've spent a lot of time with you discussing this warmth here and the fact that the ridge is set over it. And I've made a case. If this moves, we know what to expect. We've talked about this. We understand that that's going to be a major potential shift in ocean temperatures, which has a feedback in the atmosphere. In fact, it's kind of a chicken and the egg type thing, as Matt and I were discussing, where they work with or against each other to change the jet stream pattern. I've made a case that if that moves while this stays cool, we get a large southwest ridge. That's happened in the historical past when the ocean temperatures are doing these things. And if that's the case, by summer we get ridge riding storms that come over the top, while the southwest is where we struggle with the greatest heat. And we even looked at the recent model runs, which are kind of supportive of that. But still, I've been burned big time. Last Monday was my worst forecast this spring, not the one that just happened, but a week ago, where I thought the pattern was going to shift because that guy was moving around. I really had myself convinced, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. My biggest trouble was that I wanted to be convinced that it was going to shift, and that's not good. That's confirming my own biases, and I really try hard to stay away from that. But what I thought was, I saw this. See that cooling there and the warming here? That would have pushed the ridge toward the west coast. And even though that's what we had in 19, we didn't have the downstream big trough over Canada to keep the pattern wet. So if we could have moved that ridge toward the west coast over the last 8 days, planting windows would have blasted open and people would be done. And we wouldn't be talking about flooding in Texas. We wouldn't have the same conversations we've been having right now. And that just brings me to another important point. Matt looked at this and he says, well, I mean, this is kind of alarming to me. And I said, yeah. He said, well, I know it's where we take the global temperatures right now and compute an average against the global temperatures right now. So in other words, it's not relative to history, it's relative to this moment. But he said, if we don't break away from this, and I completely agree with him, if there's cold water here, 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 and there, this sets up the classic summer triple ridge pattern with a ridge there, a ridge here, and a ridge somewhere out in the open Atlantic. And we don't want this. Nobody wants this. Even the West Coast doesn't want this, because even though this would steer them away from heat and major fire risk, this would keep the West away from getting the heat units they need. And it would bring in troughs in between. So there'd be troughs. I'm just kind of generically drawing this, but there'd be troughs in those areas. And we'd have storms and wet weather. In the West, the way they manage the water for their crops, their cuttings of hay, all of their crops are dependent on a real dry season. It's the normal summer dry season. And if you're in the Midwest, this builds into a massive ridge. And all that water that we've got stored in the soil right now, well, we start just ticking the clock on how it gets depleted. If you live around the periphery of this ridge, it's nonstop storms. And so Matt was just bringing this up to say, if our global average ocean temperatures, and you compare them to historical normals, looks like this by the time we get to summer, we're in trouble. And I completely agree with him. But when we do this, we have to just be careful to realize that these are rather subtle differences overall. And Matt knows this. And so I've got to just come back to where we currently stand. These are sea surface temperature anomalies compared to history. And just have to start watching where this warm water goes. What is the eventual outcome of our La Nina? Does it continue to kind of ebb and flow? Is it weaker or is it stronger? These are still questions that need to be answered. And the North Atlantic, how does it transition? Because there's a million ways to get drought and there's a million ways to have a fantastic growing season. There's not one set way. I just told you, though, the one I'm most concerned about. If I'm in the Midwest, I don't want a massive ridge of high pressure here. And I don't want the Bermuda high to move over to about there. because left in the lurch is a big ridge that sits somewhere in here. And the atmosphere loses its momentum. The jet stream shifts north, so it runs right over the top of this, keeping us out of the good flow. I'm talking about us being the Midwest, the Corn Belt. This is my backyard again. And all around it storms like mad. So the West Coast, across the South, East Coast, and then hurricanes just come punching into this late in the season. So I just wanted to confess what has been renting a lot of space in my mind for the last, months. But man, if I could just rewind the clock and go back to last Monday and not buy into the model shift, that would have been a key thing that I missed, and I wish I could go back and change that. But here we are, and you learn from mistakes. That's where wisdom comes from. So I'm happy that it happened, but now we got to look and see what the pattern's going to do from here going forward. So let's get past these maps and get here. It was the European model that kind of burned me on this, but since then I feel like it's grabbed the pattern again, and it's matched better with the GFS. I'm talking about the overall pattern, not the individual model runs. This is the newest 14-day outlook on precipitation compared to average. And while we're wetter through the Midwest toward New England, the Canadian prairie's wetter, we see some drier conditions trying to come out into this region from Colorado into Kansas, into Oklahoma, while this stretch right down here continues to stormy. What is there? Why do I buy into this? Well, I'm going to show you the artificial intelligence side of this as well. I feel like this is a model that has helped us kind of tease out in the week 2 pattern what the ensemble tends to blend up and remove, and that is features in the jet stream. So take a look. As we play through the rest of the day today and toward Thursday and Friday, there is a broad trough here. We'll take a look at the severe weather threat out of this. I'm watching this. In the forecast models, a week ago, the depth of this trough, it was washed out. It wasn't there. But we've got this kind of flow. There's 1, 2, one that's exiting, and a fourth down here. And the reality of that is an active U.S. pattern. So this is this weekend, Saturday, getting into Sunday. And what I'm going to be watching very carefully is this trough and its interaction with what's going on here. There's a chance that this gets flung out ahead of this. Watch. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. See it kind of slingshot it? Watch this guy right here. It'll get grabbed by the base of this trough and just tossed right toward Iowa. See that? And that's kind of a lead system. And if it does follow this trajectory, it's wet this whole trip, especially once it gets here. But then following it into midweek next week, we have to watch this. And it's in the ensembles. It's a bit washed out, but this is that severe weather risk we talked about midweek next week coming around the base of this trough. And where's our ridge? North of Hawaii. Went back to that same area. So storm systems are coming around like this, and that's what's keeping us active. It's much different than what we had in 19, which was extremely wet as well. So here we are out 10 days, and the models keep tossing this in. Now, yesterday, what we talked about was that we saw this trough a bit stalling here and one stalling here. And I said, hey, there's some ridging, some warm, some windy, a couple of better days at the end of the month of May. We looked at that GDD analysis after this. The newest runs are progressing this, though. So it's not like it's just leaving it there. It's trying to bring that feature through and get it going. And I look out there toward the end of the month and just these last 2 weeks of May, which is where I kind of want to live today, all right, and just say, I don't have evidence in the next 2 weeks that we just blast ourselves away from this pattern and all is cured for those that need to get rid of the rain. So we just need to know that and start to look out for when that could potentially happen. We need something big to come in and disrupt this pattern. So that gives us this. This is the new artificial intelligence forecast over the next 7 days. So just take a good look at this and where it's putting down its precipitation. I do want to focus in on the north central United States. I want to show you this map and just put some numbers on it. Now, we don't take verbatim the AIFS forecast for precipitation. This is all about pattern. But if you just broad brush strokes, I've got a lot of the Corn Belt grabbing another inch, in some places over 2 inches of total accumulated precip. Now, we need to see if other models agree with this. Okay, so if we go look, this is the NBM, the National Blend of Models. It's wettest again here, wettest in parts of the eastern Corn Belt, and then down here in Texas, along the southeast, up the East Coast, very wet. Canadian prairie, very wet. What about the WPC? Look at this streak in through here. We're going to talk about this in a few moments. From parts of Nebraska all the way to Wisconsin. Extremely wet where we don't need another drop right now, down here across the south. And again, beating back any sort of early season drought risk across the east. Canadian Prairie stormy with this as well. This is the European model, and I want to really hone in on one feature that the new European model came up with there versus look at this. That's the GFS, which puts it here. And the model differences right now are remarkable. If you look at these maps, I show them to you quite often. These colors represent where the GFS is wetter and by how much compared to the European. So this is a direct model comparison, a difference. So when you look in through here, the point is to say that the GFS in that area is 1 to 3.5 inches wetter, while the European is wetter here, meaning it's got this different trajectory in the next system. Now, I just selected these two large areas. That's not to ignore other spots around the country, but if that's where we're going, we need to understand where we are right now. And if you just take a look at some recent satellite data, this is as the sun was rising this morning. See some of the smoke still here on the backside? This is the system that we were talking about last week living in Arizona on the weekend, still moving its way farther to the east. And yesterday, let me take you back and show you this. That low as it curled up here, we had some large complexes of storms on either side of it. So you can see out ahead of it here, the back side of it there with the showers, the smoke in between, and many large complexes of storms that kind of blew up here coming off the Rocky Mountains into the plains. If we just take a look back at yesterday's storm reports, hail in parts of Nebraska, a couple of tornadoes that showed up right on the border between Kansas and Colorado. You can see wind and hail reports here, and then again, bigger storms that got into parts of the Carolinas all the way down to Georgia and Florida. So today, this is where we're keeping an eye on things. Storm Prediction Center's watching that Carolina region down into Florida. You can see, though, that a big area of concern is going to be from the Texas Panhandle through parts of Oklahoma into southern Kansas. Tomorrow, we keep this again in Texas, but there's a broader area of thunderstorm risk to the north. And then as you look out there on the 17th, this is going to move over Louisiana and Mississippi. So let's finally get into some model runs here. High-res NAM starting off at 7 a.m. this morning. If we play this forward, there's that rain we talked about this week coming into the Red River Valley of the North. The scattered showers on the backside, some embedded thunderstorms here with the low that, again, Saturday was in Arizona. Today it's here. And then as we get into this evening, we're going to keep a close eye on the complexes of storms coming out in this area. Now, again, these models early in the morning will not capture storm timing, storm structure, but the idea in the model is that we're going to have to watch out for some individual cells that could possibly line out in the overnight hours into the early morning. See this? And then by tomorrow, what I'm mostly concerned about is where the storms here end up. If they do get back into this part of Texas, that is right where we had all that flooding. This is Thursday evening as we play forward. Very wet weather moving into the mid-south, southern Illinois, Kentucky, southern Indiana. And this, again, is an area that lately has seen a lot of precipitation. We're just adding more to that area while storms continue to roll across the south. That's just through early Friday morning, kind of keeping an eye on this, and you can already see the next system that's sneaking into parts of Montana here. So we need to see that one by flipping over to some other models. But first, just take a look at this. Why I don't like this pattern so much? Well, there's a lot of reasons. But should that complex sneak out down here and hit this area with heavy rainfall, I mean, we started this whole discussion there, right? That is the same climate reporting district that's currently having its wettest start to May on record. And we're seeing the moisture kind of diving into that same region. So let's get back to that and flip over to the European on the right versus the GFS. We've let the NAM kind of guide us, excuse me, through here. And we're going to keep an eye by the time we get into early Saturday morning on a low that's here in parts of the Canadian Prairie. So we kind of have two. There's one here and there's one that's down here. It's in both models. We just need to see how the evolution of those lows goes. So there's Saturday into Sunday. The GFS much wetter up the mid-Atlantic throughout Sunday than the European. And then as we get into early next week, you can just get a sense of the broad trough in the west. So notice the wet weather that's coming through the upper Midwest, but still systems rolling through the Northwest. This would be next Tuesday into Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week. And the idea here is that the pattern's not slowing down. Now, as I mentioned, as we transition toward the latter half of spring and into summer, These animations, which we love to look at all winter, actually all fall, all winter, and most of spring, they start to lose their ability to show well-defined features. And so we're going to spend a lot more time looking at probability maps or total precipitation maps and changes in those, because I think the probability really hones in on what we need to be keeping an eye on. So this is this morning's 0Z European ensemble forecast, looking at the chance of an inch for the next 7 days. And now we've found those components we just discussed. Playing it forward, let's just add this all up to a 10-day outlook. And that's the chance over the next 10 days of getting an inch. There are places, though, that any rain is going to cause delays. And so we just have to be aware that this is the pattern we're in, at least I think through the end of May. The Climate Prediction Center yesterday continued to hone in on this area from the 22nd to the 25th as having a slight risk of heavy precipitation. So that's been a consistent feature with them as well. And as we look out there into week 2, we've now seen that the CPC is continuing to increase the risk of being above average here. It's also in the new European, and it's been in the GFS. So we're looking at all three of these models, seeing kind of a similar setup, which is good to get some agreement in this finally. You know that back on Monday, it was the European model, not this Monday, but the previous, that went drier, while the other models stayed wetter. And now we've got better agreement in them, which is lending to a bit more increased confidence. This gets us all the way up to the 28th of May, 28th, 29th of May. It's almost to the Indy 500 here. Or no, that's past the Indy 500. Sorry, I love that race. I'm going over to Carb Day. I'm not going to go to the race this year. I have other commitments, but man, I can't wait. So sorry about that. Okay, temperature-wise, frost risk today, a lot in the UP, northern Wisconsin. Most of this is at elevation out west. As we look over the next 7 days, this is how much heat we're picking up. So if there was the opportunity to get a crop in over Mother's Day weekend, which I know a lot of you did, we are grabbing, I'm thinking about the ice states here, between 110 and 150 GDDs over the next 7 days. So that means there's some warmth in this pattern. But if we look, going back to April 1st, it's the west that needs the warmth. That's where the deficits are. And while it's there now, we've got warm temperatures. Look at this. This is today's high temperatures. Central Valley, California, up into Oregon, Washington. We're above average, deep into the 90s here. As we play this forward into Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, see this cooler air coming to the northwest? That knocked the temperatures off about 10 degrees here. And now we're down watching the very southern tier of the U.S. and the southwest for excessive heat. 100 degrees are going to line up right into this area, which isn't uncommon, but it's still warmer than average. So this is Saturday, getting into Sunday and Monday. And while the west cools back off again, take a look at the heat that's in southern Texas. We're watching that because that's the area that the Climate Prediction Center has honed in on from the 22nd to the 28th of having the risk of excessive heat. So we'll watch this carefully. As we go out there, day 5 through 10, there it is. But much cooler west, northern plains, Canadian prairie. Day 10 through 15, we don't necessarily get a lot of heat early in the season here. It's all going to be down here across the south, and that's echoed in the European as well. So this is day 5 through 10. And that takes us out there day 10 through 15. So we've really split the country with heat south and cooler than average north. Now remember, when we get this configuration of temperatures, this is a signal for wind, stronger than average winds, which means we have to be aware of that as well. That gets you to May 30th. All right, I kind of gave you some of my longer range ideas at the beginning of this. And we looked at the model trends in the European model weeklies yesterday. So today, I gotta simmer on this. I gotta think harder about it. So I'm not gonna go dipping out there through June and giving, what could be just a bad idea, because I need more time. So what we want to do is just look a bit international. And what I want to show you here is kind of your next, let's get that so you can see it. There you go. Your next 10 days on the European model, looking at precipitation anomalies. We continue to be wet south of the Yangtze, all of Indonesia. Look at this, getting over here toward southern India, very wet. Take note of this. The European model this morning had two major shifts, one here and one here, bringing in rain into this part of the Russian wheat belt. Remember, this area had been very dry and very cold. So now to see the model trying to toss in rain, we are going to just question this because that would be breaking a long-standing pattern. Same thing for Brazil. The models yesterday were very aggressive on the wet conditions in southern Brazil returning, and you can see it here. That's just through the next, 4 or 5 days. But yesterday's model runs day 7 through 10 tried to dump even more in through here. You heard me repeat it, like another 3 to 7 inches of rain or something like that I mentioned yesterday. They now have that sliding a bit farther to the south. The reality is any rain in this area is going to continue the flooding. But I wanted you just to see that there has been a bit of a model fluctuation there, and we'll just consider it and see what it means going forward. So that's where I'm going to stop today. I'll spend some more time kind of putting together these long-range ideas as we finish out this week. But I appreciate your attention and hope you all have a good rest of your Wednesday. Talk to you soon. Thanks.